Welcome to Capital Crime. My name is Siraj. Thank you for joining me for our very first episode. Today we're going back in time, 110 years to be exact, to the little town of Villisca, Iowa. With a population of roughly 1,200 residents, there wasn't much in terms of attractions or amusement, and Villisca wasn't notable for its courthouse, its Presbyterian church, or its railroad system. But they all played a pivotal role in setting the scene for one of the most atrocious massacres in all of American history. The Villisca Axe Murders. Despite various suspects, 2 trials, and a confession, Villisca Axe Murders have stumped investigators for well over a century. To start off our story, it was an ordinary day for the Moore family as they awoke on Sunday, June 9th, 1912. In the evening, Joe and his wife Sarah took their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, to their Presbyterian church to attend a Children's Day service. Along with their children, the Moores brought along Lena and Ina Stillinger. They were their neighbors' children who were going to spend the night with the Moore kids. The Children's Day service was an end-of-the-year Sunday school program. Sarah was the co-director, and her children performed their little speeches and recitations along with other Sunday school members. The service ended with members socializing until around 9:30 p.m. No one could have foretold the brutality that the family and their guests would face in the coming hours as they left. They walked just 3 blocks to their house. The family stayed up a few more hours, ending their evening with milk and cookies, after which they all tucked into bed and, presumably, went to sleep. Joe and Sarah were asleep upstairs, while their 4 children were sleeping in a room down the hall. The 2 Stillinger sisters were in a guest room on the first floor. Shortly after midnight, the killer entered the house from the backyard through an unlocked door, which was not an uncommon sight as the residents considered it a small, safe, and friendly community where they all knew each other. The intruder grabbed an oil lamp off a nearby dresser, removed the chimney, bent the wick in 2 to create a smaller flame, lit the lamp, burned it so low that it cast only the faintest glimmer. In one hand, he held the lamp to light his way through the Moore's peaceful home. In the other, he held an axe. The axe was Joe's, presumably taken from where it had been left in the coal shed. The stranger silently swept through the bottom floor of the house, ignoring the sleeping girls. He made his way up the stairs. He went past the children's room and directly into Mr. and Mrs. Moore's bedroom. He moved almost gracefully through the house as if he had already gotten a thorough tour of the place. In their own beds, the killer gazed upon the sleeping couple. Without hesitation, he began his demented ritual of death by raising the axe high above his head. So high, in fact, that it got stuck and gouged the ceiling. The man used the flat end of the axe to strike Joe Moore's head, crushing his skull and probably killing him instantly. Then he struck Sarah before she even had time to wake up. The killer then made his way to the children's room, where he presumably took the life of each child one by one. Once again, there was no evidence that Herman, Catherine, Boyd, or Paul woke up before they died. The intruder was as silent as he was brutal, and none of the 4 children made sufficient noise to disturb Catherine's 2 friends, Lena and Ina Stillinger, as they slept downstairs. The killer then descended down the stairs and took his axe to the sleeping girls. Ina was killed first, and Lena, the older sister, may have finally woken up just an instant before she too was murdered. Even more disturbingly, the killer was not yet finished with his rampage. He went back upstairs and systematically reduced the heads of all 6 members to a bloody pulp, striking Joe alone an estimated 30 times and leaving the faces of all 6 members of the family unrecognizable. He then used bedcloths to cover Joe and Sarah's shattered heads, placed a shirt over Herman's face, and a dress over Catherine's. He then covered Boyd and Paul as well. The girls were met with the same terrible post-mortem punishment. He also used bed sheets and other pieces of cloth to cover every mirror and window in the house. At some point, the killer also took a 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon, wrapped it in a towel, and then placed it on the floor of the downstairs bedroom close to a short piece of keychain that was apparently left by the killer. The axe, partially wiped of blood, leaned against the wall where the girls were sleeping. He seemed to have stayed inside the house for quite some time, even filling a bowl with water and washing his bloody hands in it. Along with all of these peculiar acts, such as the mysterious slab of bacon, covered glass, and heads of all the victims being smashed and covered, Lena Stillinger's nightgown had also been pulled up, exposing her. Although doctors concluded that she hadn't been sexually assaulted. Sometime before 5 a.m., he abandoned the lamp at the top of the stairs and left. In a similar fashion to the way he entered the house, the killer disappeared into the night like a phantom, taking keys from the house to lock the door behind him. By 7:30 a.m. on June 10th, Mary Peckham, an elderly neighbor, became concerned that the Moore house seemed quiet and deserted. Usually a bustling and rowdy household, that morning, as the sun rose to warm the frost from the night before, the house showed no signs of life. Word, she called Joe's brother, Ross, and asked him to investigate. Ross arrived around 8 a.m. He found a key on his chain that opened the front door. He cautiously investigated the first floor and found 2 figures covered with bloody sheets. He ran out of the house asking for Villisca's marshal, Hank Horton. Horton brought along the county coroner and Dr. Williams. The kind of troubling news could not be contained, and dozens of neighbors and townspeople began to gather outside of the Moores' once charming home. Prior to the crowd stampeding through the house, Horton and Dr. Williams got a glimpse of the scene to examine the bodies and estimate a time of death. At least 100 people entered the house as their morbid curiosity drove them from room to room to witness the horrific sights. The careless crowd disturbed crucial evidence as they rummaged through the house, ruining any fingerprints that might have been left by the perpetrator and rendering the crime scene useless for investigators, and in one case, even removing fragments of Joe's skull as memorabilia. Whispers turned into disgruntled ramblings amongst the crowd as they questioned as to who could have possibly been capable of such horrific crimes. Some believed it to have been the work of the devil, while others pointed to a possible serial killer who stopped by as the town was situated just along the railroad. In fact, murders along the railroad had been begun to sprawl up, and in similar fashion to the Moores, their heads were bashed in with an axe, and all of the windows and mirrors had been covered with cloth that was found around the house. Given the nature of the crime and the gruesome scene left behind by the killer, the police shockingly had very few leads. A few half-hearted efforts to search for the killer were fruitless, as even the officials believed that the 5-hour head start that the killer had gave him ample time to get away. Bloodhounds were brought in to help with the search, but they too were ineffective as far too much time had passed and the scent of the killer had long ago dissipated. The crime scene itself was already a mess, given the method of execution, but the townspeople rendered it entirely useless for investigators to retrieve any evidence, so maybe police not having any solid leads was not all that surprising. A few names did spark the interest of authorities over time, although none of them developed any favorable outcomes. The first name to come to the attention of the police was that of longtime rival and former boss of Joe's, Frank Jones. Frank was a local businessman who sold farm equipment. Frank and Joe worked together for 7 years before Joe decided to leave and become Frank's competitor. Although they had deep hatred for each other, no one would admit that it was bad enough to provoke murder, let alone massacre Joe's entire family. At 5:19 a.m. in the morning, following the massacre, Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly left Villisca and boarded a train headed westbound. Fellow travelers allegedly recounted that the Reverend shared with them details about 8 dead souls in Villisca, butchered in their own beds while they slept. The bodies weren't discovered until 8:30 by Joe's brother. Kelly, coincidentally, had just arrived in Villisca that Sunday morning of the massacre and was an attendee at the Sunday school performance. He also left the following Monday. Kelly returned 2 weeks later after the murders and posed as a detective to tour the murder house with a group of investigators. The authorities wanted to speak with the Reverend in connection with the murders a few weeks later after a recipient of one of his rather unusual and belligerent letters came forward. To start off with, Kelly actually immigrated from England with his family in 1904. And as a child, he suffered an extremely distressing mental breakdown that impacted him long into adulthood. He also came from a long line of reverends and ministers, as his grandfather and father were one as well. Kelly was preaching at Methodist churches in the Midwest. He would oftentimes be assigned as a visiting minister to a few small towns just north of Villisca. It was there that he gained notoriety for his gross behavior. Kelly was so sexually desperate, he took out a local ad seeking to hire a young secretary to help type his novel. A girl just out of high school responded to his ad, and he became so excited that he revealed to her that she would be requested to type while naked. Shocked by his revelation, she took the letter to her pastor, who then turned it over to the county sheriff. They conducted a little stint and responded to his letters to get more details. After they were satisfied with their findings, they arrested him. Upon questioning him, though, it was clear that Kelly was beyond mentally unstable. He was sent to St. Elizabeth's National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. The doctors diagnosed him as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Kelly was brought in for the massacre in the Moore House, and he was interrogated all throughout the summer of 1917. He confessed. Kelly signed a letter of confession to the murder saying God had whispered to him to, quote, "suffer the children to come unto me," end quote. During the trial, he recounted his statements. The jury was deadlocked, and a second trial was to be held. The second set of jurors, however, found Kelly not guilty, and he was acquitted in November. Throughout the last 110 years, many names have been brought up as possible suspects. However, no one else has been tried for the murders, and to date, it is still one of the most brutal, unsolved mass murders in American history. Thank you so much for watching. Are there any mass murders, serial killers, or events you would like me to cover next? Comment below. Share this video if you liked it. Dislike if you didn't. No one's going to see it anyway. And as always, I'll see you next time.